Welcome to A Look Inside. I'm your host, Demetria Head, and today's special guest is Robert Drews, author of Look for Something Good. Welcome, welcome.
Thanks, Demetria. Thanks for asking me. I'm happy to be here and happy to be talking to a Midwesterner, being a sort of displaced Midwesterner myself.
Happy to have you. Talking about your book, Look for Something Good, let's talk about some of the characters. So, J.J. Worth, the main character, he's relatable and he's a quietly compelling protagonist. So, what inspired you to tell a story from the perspective of someone experiencing such a deep internal shift later in life?
Well, I started out, I didn't really have a mission with the book, but I wanted to write a book. I wanted to write a novel that would tell a story of someone who found strength and found a way back,
Hmm.
who was able to overcome it, overcome some personal despair. As I tell people, at its most simple, I want readers just to feel good or at least better when they finish my book.
Mm.
Admittedly, not all difficulties are solvable. There's no hunky dory in the book, but
Yeah.
at the very least, difficulties can be manageable. And I will say the book is by no means an autobiography of myself, but or that I'm personified by JJ, but I was able to establish his despair at the start because of my own despair about 20 years earlier when I was transferred out of a job that I really loved into a job I hated. So I
Wow.
was able to come up with a character who had experienced what I did.
Hmm. Okay. Because definitely was going to ask, is this about you?
It's not. I mean,
Okay.
every novel to some extent is about the author. You can't write a novel without injecting yourself into it somehow. But,
Yeah.
is J.J. Worth a
Hmm.
personification of Robert Drews? Absolutely not.
Okay. Okay. So the relationship between JJ and Father Thomas, that adds both warmth and depth to the novel. How did your dynamic evolve in your imagination as you were writing?
It's interesting. After I wrote the first, I knew how I wanted the book to start, obviously, and how to proceed. But I'd written a couple of chapters, and I stopped and I said, this book is just going to die under its own weight because JJ cannot be the singular focus of this book.
Hmm.
And so I said, I've got to have another character that JJ can relate to. And so Father Thomas was born, and
Hmm.
I was able to link the two of them up at a baseball game, and it was just a perfect segue into these two characters meeting.
Okay. So from career loss to spiritual reflection, JJ's journey seems to touch on themes many readers may face. What was most important to you about capturing that process authentically?
What I really wanted to do was I I myself relied on empathy. I remember years ago when I was in seventh grade, I had a class. In those days, they had classes that they were entitled reading, and you read books and
Hmm.
you discussed the book in class. And I remember one time, one of the things you had to do was to read from a book that you picked. And when I read out loud, I always remember this, the teacher, gosh, seventh grade, how old are you? 13 or 12? The
Yeah.
teacher said,
Mhm.
Bob has been blessed with empathy. And so I've always been able to rely on empathy. I've always felt empathy for people who have lost loved ones, as we all have,
Hmm.
people who've lost jobs, people who've lost direction. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to translate loss through JJ and Father Thomas, and then ultimately the people they interact with as they go out on their own looking for the good.
Hmm. Okay. So faith obviously is woven throughout the story, but it never overwhelms the narrative. So, how did you approach writing spiritual themes in a way that invites rather than instructs?
Well, as you said, I didn't want this book to be preachy. I didn't want it to set religious standards. I
Mhm.
didn't want it to hit people between the eyes, that God is the answer to everything. Because the book is not about religion,
Right.
and it's not really about God. It's
Mhm.
about how people can incorporate religion and God into their own lives as we do or as we should. The book is not doctrinaire. I mean, Father Thomas is Catholic, but
Mhm.
he's not, but he's broad-minded about it. There is a part in the book, I'm not going to give a lot of it away, but there's a part in the book where he meets and befriends a Muslim family.
Mhm.
And there is a line in the book where I say it, and I believe it, that the afterlife, the Almighty God, whoever you want to believe in, to me is like many rivers flowing into one ocean. And
Mhm.
I want people to, in fact, when people read the book before it was accepted at this publisher, the reader had said the thing they liked about the book is that religion and faith and the divine are in it, but it's not saying my faith and my religion is the only way to go.
Right. Right. Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit more about Father Thomas. He's a fascinating figure, equal parts laid back and deeply wise. So what went into shaping his character and background?
Interesting about Father Thomas, some people have said, um, the book started with JJ, but Father Thomas kind of overtook the book because the guy is sort of larger than life. But
Hmm.
I really love the character of Father Thomas because his story is a complete creation of my own imagination. I
Hmm.
don't know anybody like Father Thomas. I know somebody who had the physique of Father Thomas.
Hmm.
His hulking size is kind of based on a friend of mine's, but he could never look at the book and point to it and say, "Hey, you copied me into Father Thomas." It's not true. But what Father Thomas shows to me, and I think perhaps to other writers, is really one of the joys of writing a novel is that you can create a person that you want to exist and you'd like to be friends with. And I just, as much as I put, as again, part of myself into JJ, there is nothing of myself in Father Thomas other than, we both like baseball.
Hmm.
But other than that, Father Thomas is just a guy that I made up.
Hmm. Okay. So the story opens with quiet introspection, excuse me, and gradually expands outward. How did you decide on the book's tone and pacing?
Um, the book, the pacing of the book, when they both get into they're looking for the good was based on a road trip my wife and I took in the fall of 2016.
Hmm.
But the book is not an itinerary of our trip. I mean, in fact, the genesis of this book came while we were on the trip. And I said, there might be a book in me in which there's a thread of a road trip, but there's a much larger story and a much larger message. So some of the places on the road trip are in the book. Although this isn't like a travel log. I use those places as a point to meet people I made up, to experience events that I made up.
Hmm.
Some of the places in the book I've been to on my own before my wife and I were married. Some of the places I have never been to. There's a city in the south that I went that is in the book. I've
Hmm.
never been into it, but I looked. What I did is I took out the map that my wife and I had for our road trip, and then I created my own map, my own road trip map for JJ and the places he went. And example, there in one of the cities in the south, there's a city park where JJ meets a character. Well, that city park exists, but it exists in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, where I grew up. That park is real. But I
Yeah.
placed that park in a city in the South. And so that was the pacing of it. Once I had JJ and Father Thomas in the book, I
Hmm.
could get out my men and I'd say, okay, where are they going to go next? And that's the pacing that came up with, and it really worked, to my mind, really well.
Hmm. Yeah. So, which part of the book do you think was the most challenging for you to write?
I can't say any single part of it was.
Mm.
It's interesting because what I would do is before I wrote each chapter, I didn't just, to me, it's just a useless exercise to sit and stare at a blank screen and say, okay, what am I going to write now? I went into every chapter with notes, some written notes, some notes that I had taken, I translated and I put on a Word document and I printed out. And it's funny because I would start out by saying, okay, today JJ is going to go to blank city.
Hmm.
And I have notes about what he might do along the way, but the words just float sometimes, I mean,
Hmm.
it's just hard to explain, but the words just came, and I said,
Yeah.
I coach writing students up at the college, and I say, sometimes if you have an idea of what you want to write, just sit down and you'd be shocked at how the writing just comes out.
Yeah.
So writing is always a challenge.
Mm.
Whereas any one part of the book a challenge, I suppose the biggest challenge was, what do I do now? And I said, okay, I have hit a roadblock
Hmm.
with JJ. And I said, JJ can carry on through the book, but this book is going to end up being 10 chapters and really kind of dull. So when I had to come up with Father Thomas,
Hmm.
that's when I was challenged. And gosh, I just love the character. It came out fine.
Well, I absolutely enjoyed the book and I love the characters. So much of the novel feels like a conversation about reconnecting with self, faith, and others. Why do you think that idea of reconnection resonates so strongly today or in today's world?
Well, for me, I think I think in today's world, where you can constantly be connected with people on social media. I'll go to a restaurant and I'll see people sitting alone and just staring at their cell phone.
Hmm.
Will somebody talk to me? What can I look at? I think, I'm 76 years old, so I grew up at a time when you were alone a lot. We were a family of seven, but I had four sisters, and so I spent a lot of time alone.
Hmm.
And I like being alone. I mean, I have no problems with being alone. I have no problems with. I don't even have a. I don't have a smartphone. My cell phone is for texting and calling and taking pictures. I
Hmm.
don't feel any need to keep texting and connecting with people. I think in this book, I mean, one of the notions I want to get across is that I think people are afraid now of being alone or connecting with other people. So what they do is they connect on the internet or on social media. And the idea of overcoming their fear and talking to a stranger face to face is really becoming a lost art. And
Hmm.
I think being able to connect with our own selves and being able to connect with a God who
Hmm.
we believe in, I think it's a beautiful thing.
Hmm.
And that's one of the things I wanted to get through in this book, that both JJ and Father Thomas, they're out meeting people that they've never met.
Hmm.
And yeah, just randomly connecting. I mean, that's the essence of the story. Look for something good. They're not treasure hunting. They're
Hmm.
not going out there looking on, some big road trip where they're seeing how many museums they can go to, or how many parks they can go to, how many places they can go to, and post it on Facebook. Here I am. All the time I see people on Facebook. This is my vacation. This is my wonderful life. These are all the great places I go. These two people are going. They never post a thing anywhere on social media. They're
Hmm.
not out to do that. They are out to meet people and find situations and connect with people that they do not know and to see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And that's looking for the good. Looking for something good is not going and seeing how many national parks I can visit. That's not looking for something good.
Right, right. You know, it reminds me when you were talking about that and how you believe that some people are just afraid of alone, but most people hide behind social media. They don't go out in the real world and experience that true connection, you know, talking to strangers. I do remember growing up, um, even in the 1980s. Um, I always saw, because my parents are from a different era or generation, and I always saw my parents traveled. They did spontaneous things like that. And they were always meeting new meeting new people and engaging and talking with new people. And when I was younger, I'm like, do you know them? Mom, Dad, do you know them? Because they would talk to
Yeah.
strangers. You would think that they knew these people for like 20 and 30 years, but that's what people did, you know, back in the day. They weren't afraid to, you know, have conversations and speak to people and meet different people from all walks of life. Now, it's a challenge for some people, I won't say all, to even get a conversation started because so many people are used to texting and just, you know, communicating on social media, you know, because no one gets to see you. They don't know what you look like unless you have a picture, you know, but it's a different climate, definitely.
Very true. You know, and interesting about your parents, because mine were the same way. Years ago, my parents had they were going to Hawaii, and they were waiting in line at the airport. I don't know where it was, Milwaukee or somewhere, or maybe they'd flown out to California first. And the couple, either in front of them or behind them, they just started to talk with them. And they ended up, I guess they were near each other also on the plane. They got to Hawaii and they linked up, and the other couple had rented a car and they drove all over Hawaii together, and they became friends with them. And the couple they met, turns out that they were from Minnesota, and they used
Oh,
to come and
wow.
visit my parents in Wisconsin, and they were friends with this couple until both the man and the woman, this other couple, passed away years later. And it
Oh,
was just two people that they met in line at an airport. And now, you know, you say, Carson City is really nice because you can say hi to people or wave to, if I'm outside cutting the grass and somebody goes by, I wave to them.
hmm.
I'll tell you, Dimitri, when I lived in California, if I was outside and somebody walked past my house that didn't know me and I didn't know them, I'd say hi to them and they'd recoil as if to say, what do you want? Or what are you trying to sell?
Yeah, it's
It's
totally
sad.
different.
It's very sad. It's funny because we've never lived at a time when there's more connection,
Hmm.
but it's all electronic.
Hmm.
And people, you can say, hey, I've got 950 friends on Facebook,
Hmm.
and yet I don't have one friend that I can call and say hi to and ask how you doing.
Right.
And it's just totally different.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a moment where JJ begins to think about travel and unpredictability. Without giving too much away, can you share why spontaneity became important in his story?
Sure. The character at the beginning, right, where I create JJ, he's always been very happy in this own little world that he's created, and he's going along smoothly. And he thinks nothing is going to upset just the way his life is evolving. He's now 61 years old. He's got everything planned out. Everything's good. And indeed, on the day that he was blindsided with a layoff, which is, you know, what catapulted him into changing his life around, he'd gone to work figuring everything was fine, and he'd carefully scripted the day just like he always did, right down to what he was going to have for lunch.
Hmm.
And then, boom, out of the blue, he does not know what to do. You know, what do I do next? So as he looks for answers, he tries to find what he should do and what he might do next. And so this notion of a random road trip that comes to him while he's watching a financial program, he never even thought of doing something like this.
Mhm.
But you know, this spontaneity sort of hit him between the eyes and brought him out of this cocoon that he built. Now, there's nothing wrong with being happy with your life as you've created. I'm not saying everybody should be, looking to, to break out of what they're doing, but he was convinced nothing would ever change. And sometimes it does, and change happens to all of us.
Mhm.
And for JJ, it catapulted him into something he never figured he'd ever do. Now, one thing I want to point out is the road trip in this book it's not like a catalog of a road trip. It's not saying, hey, this is a real cool city you should go to.
Mhm.
Nothing in this book ever describes cities or places you'll want to go. The road trip is just a thread. It's just a thread for the evolving of the book and the evolution of JJ's character
Yeah.
once he has to find something new.
Okay. The novel also blends elements of spiritual fiction with literary realism. Were there particular books or authors that influenced your style or approach?
Not really. I mean, no, there's no book that I read all different kinds of books. I'm not really much into science fiction or horror. My oldest sister, gosh, she just loved horror novels, And one time she had a great remark. She loved horror movies and loved horror novels. And I said, "Aren't you scared reading this stuff?" And she said, "Bob, horror stories aren't scary. Life is." And, well put, Jeannie. But I didn't model my book after any author. I didn't model it after any kind of a book. Instead, I read books like, I like the Jack Reacher character in Lee Child.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar, I don't know if you're familiar with Kristen Hanna, but these are authors who tell stories about emotions and situations
Hmm.
that really compel you. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar. You nodded kind of when you heard about Jack Reacher. I mean, I love the character of Jack Reacher.
Hmm.
How he goes around and finds situations to rectify. And I suppose in a way, JJ and Father Thomas are like that, although they don't go into a town and clean up all the bad guys,
Hmm.
but they go from place to place to place and find some meaning in it.
Yeah.
And I will say that I like books like that stir your emotions. And indeed, in one of Kristen Hanna's books, at the very end, I sobbed. I put my face in my hands and I sobbed.
Hmm.
And there was one Lee Child book where Jack Reacher at the end, how he describes how he's leaving town. It was just so brilliant that I went into the library one time and all I did was read the last page because
Hmm.
it was just so exquisite in making people feel something.
Yeah.
And that's what I want in my writing too. I think people feel when they read some stories, and I didn't go out. It's funny. They say, should writers write because of what people want, or should they write because of what they want to write? And I think I can safely say there's never once I wrote in this book, this is what the readers would want.
Hmm.
I did say, man, this is really good. I'll bet readers are going to like this. But it wasn't, my motivation was not focusing on readers. My
Hmm.
motivation was focusing on myself. What do I want to write? And what do I want to say? And if people like it, fine. And if they don't, get another book.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, everything's not going to be for everyone, but I like to keep an open mind because there's so many different gems, just like this one, that I never imagined that I would be reading. And there are other genres of books just like that, that I never imagined reading. But, I try to keep an open mind, especially as a writer myself, you know. Like, for example, I never thought I'd be reading dystopian fiction. And I
Right. Yeah.
and I find that I love dystopian fiction. I
You just
suppose.
never know. As you said, open your mind to certain types of a movie or certain types of a book, and you say, "Man, this is really something. I just never thought I
Yeah.
would get that much out of this writer or this movie director."
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean that's the beauty of it. I mean, when you pick up a book or go to a movie, there's nothing that says you've got to read the whole book.
Yeah.
But there have been, I'm at a book club at the library here, and there are some books. It's funny. There are books that some people love and
Mm.
I didn't like, and there are some books that people hated. We just finished one now where everybody hated the character, and I love the character.
Mm.
And that's the beauty. That's the beauty of writing and reading, and
Yeah.
people can discuss this stuff, with an open mind, and they can just discuss it intelligently. And
Hmm.
that's the good thing about reading and writing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about the title, Look for Something Good. It's
Okay.
it's full of quiet hope. So what does that phrase mean to you personally, and how do you hope readers interpret that?
But interesting, when I started the book, I didn't have a title. And I've edited books for other folks, and one thing I always said to them was, clearly, the title of the book should be stated somewhere in the book. And when JJ, I won't say exactly where, but when he was listening to something that Father Thomas said, and JJ embraced it, and I said, this is what this book is all about.
Mm.
And once I did that, I knew, I figured the book was going to go places. But if I can digress for a minute, in the movie Jaws, I was watching a documentary on it one time,
Mhm.
and both Robert Shaw and can't remember the guy who played the oceanographer and the director even were saying, I don't really know where this movie is going to go. And
Mhm.
then there's a point in that movie where Robert Shaw talks about how he was on a ship that was sunk in World War II,
Okay.
and half of the crew were killed by sharks. And that resonated with them, and they said, that's when we knew we had a movie. And
Mhm.
so when I hit on that title, I said, that's the theme of this book,
Mhm.
that the good is all around us, and that it comes not as a thunderbolt, but in unexpected places. And important as a part of that is that we also can be the good,
Mhm.
not in just searching for the good, but we ourselves can be the good just by making a small difference in someone's life.
Yes.
There's an example in the book, and you might remember it, where JJ is out and he meets this family, these grandparents, and he befriends their grandson and helps them in a way that some readers have told me either online or in reviews of the book. They said, this could never happen. I would never allow this. And I said, but do you admit that even though you wouldn't, that this, and it's a good thing, that this could happen? Just because you say it wouldn't doesn't mean it couldn't.
Right.
And that's a message, that there are situations in the book where JJ and Father Thomas reach out to do the good in ways that may not be understood in real life, but most definitely can happen.
Hmm. Absolutely. So the story is told in a straightforward linear style, in my opinion, but it invites deep reflection. How did you balance narrative clarity with emotional complexity?
Well, I wanted the story itself and the places in it to to tap into readers' emotions.
Hmm.
I didn't say to myself, make this an emotional event. Make this something that will make people want to cry.
Hmm.
I just wrote it
Hmm.
and said, if this is how people, I didn't often even think about how it would impact people, but in reading it over, it had to, or at least it impacted me. I just wanted to let the words do the work. I mean, my book is it's really meant to be simply a story about two people who are at crossroads and take the upper road.
Hmm.
I didn't intend this ever to be a self-help manual where people connect the dots. As I said before, in one sentence, if people said, "What do you want to accomplish with this book?" I would hope that when people finish the book, they feel better or they feel good more than they did when it started.
Hmm.
There were times I myself when I laughed out loud at stuff in this book, and there were other times when I teared up. It's funny because my wife did not know I was writing this book.
Oh,
I
wow.
wanted to surprise her with it, so I would write it if she was off, visiting our children. If she was off visiting her mom, we both do things a lot, so she might be out in the afternoon. I'd make time to write.
Hmm.
I took a 2-year period to write the book. My goal was a chapter a month, and I beat. I didn't say I had to, but I wrote it in 2 years. But she
Right.
did not know I was writing this book. Sometimes she'd say, "What are you laughing about in there?" "Oh, I'm just watching Andy Griffith, something funny." And then finally, I gave it to her for Christmas. I said, "Here, I got a little surprise for you." And she looked, she said, "You wrote a book?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd like you to." And my initial goal in writing this book was, I want to write a book that my wife will like.
Oh.
And if it goes beyond that, more power to it. But I wanted her to tell me and be honest. If she said, "This book just is no good, it's boring, I don't care for," but she liked it. And a bonus, her mom liked it too. And indeed, her mom has read it twice, which to
Wow.
me is a tremendous bonus. And when my wife said, "I really like the book," I said, I'm okay with that. With that endorsement, I'm going to try sending it to publishers and see what happens.
Okay.
And that's what happened.
Yeah. And that really says a lot. That really does say a lot. With you said your mother-in-law and your wife loved it.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
twofer.
Hmm.
And my wife didn't. I work with, I've worked with a lot of reporters, and other writers, and they'd come up with a story that I'd say, this thing needs a real lot of work, and
Hmm.
they'd say, "Well, my friends liked it." Well, friends are always going to like it because they're friends. I knew my wife would tell me, and there were parts in the book,
Yeah.
particularly with female characters, where
Hmm.
when I gave my wife the book, I wrapped it up, and on the very top of the printed manuscript were 2 red pens, and I said, "Have at it." I said, "Don't be gentle." And there were parts in there, particularly with the women. There's some situations, but particularly with women, she'd say, "Bob, there's not a woman on earth who would say or think this." And so I'd go back and I'd say, "Okay, let me adapt it to what a woman would really say or think." And I'd give it back and she'd say, "Well, you're getting closer." And
Hmm.
I'd work on it, work on it, work on it. And then she'd say, "Yeah, now you got it."
Well, that's good. So you had to, give certain parts the woman's touch or the woman's voice.
For sure, I didn't know, you know, I grew up with 4 sisters. You kind of think about, you can sort of empathize. I've been married for decades, but that doesn't mean
Hmm.
how a woman would approach an event or think about something. And that's why we all need editors.
Yeah.
I mean, and I told her, don't just be a reader. Don't just sit back and at night, and laying in bed or sitting up against your pillow and read this book. I want you to critically
Hmm.
read and edit this book.
Yeah.
And she did, and it worked out fine. Now I sent it to It took me 2 years to write the book. It took me 2.5 years to find a publisher.
Hmm.
I sent it to agents, I sent it to publishers, but I did one at a time. I give everybody a month. I say, okay, if they haven't written back or if they said we don't want it, I keep on going.
Yeah.
And then finally, this boutique publisher in the South wrote back and said, yeah, we like your book.
Hmm.
And in fact, when I got the letter of acceptance, I showed it to my wife and I said, I think they've accepted the book. But then the book went through some editings. It went through two content editings and one line editing. And they too, again, raised just some brilliant points.
Hmm.
There was one in particular, there's a point with Father Thomas where there's a situation where I present the situation and I sort of kissed it off with a couple of sentences. And the line editor said, really? They said, this is a really critical juncture in the book. I want you to write more about this meeting. And I wrote 2 pages on it, and it made it much better. And that's why every editor, every writer needs an editor. You don't have to necessarily accept what they say. And indeed, there were things that the editor suggested that I disagreed with, and they were fine. The publisher, the CEO of the company said, they have their points, you have the last word, but there were times where we compromised. There were times when I totally embraced what they said. And there were times I said, no, I'm just going to stick to my guns.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I am curious to know, did they at any point try to change the direction of any part of the book or no?
No, I mean, I wouldn't say they tried to change the direction. There were parts that they questioned, some of the things that the main characters were doing, maybe that they were saying, but at no point did they say this book is just going in the wrong direction or it's
Yeah.
missing the point. No, nobody did that. And if they had, I would have said, I'm sorry, that's just the direction of this book, and that's the direction it's going to take.
Hmm.
I may tweak some stuff, because you think this is kind of going off on a tangent, but indeed, if I had given this book to 10 editors or 10 readers, I'll bet at least 9 of them would have said, take out this part. The part about when JJ befriends this boy. But there is another one. There is a chapter in there where one of the content editors said, this chapter adds nothing to the book. You should take it out.
Oh,
It
wow.
was one of my favorite chapters.
Mhm.
And indeed, before I submitted the book, there was a contest at a monthly newspaper in Reno. It was a 95-word essay contest, short story, where the essay had to be precisely 95 words, not including a title. But if you had 94 or 96, they wouldn't even read it. I said, so I boiled one of the situations in the book down to 95. Well, there were, of course, repercussions and other things in the book, but I boiled one of the meanings in the book to 95 words. And I'm going to see how this resonates. And it took second place in this writing contest.
Oh, wow.
I said, hey, I love the guy. I love the chapter. I love the people. And one of the editors said, ditch it. Well, that's just the way it is. Writing is subjective.
It is. If you had to describe JJ's emotional state at the beginning of the novel versus the end without giving away events, how would you describe that shift in just a few words?
In a few words, I would say he's gone from being not necessarily self-centered, but self-satisfied with joy in a life that he has constructed.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, he has learned in the end, or going through the book, to look beyond himself and when faced with a difficult crossroad situation, to not go into self-pity, but instead to look beyond himself for the good instead of dwelling on the bad. I
Mhm.
mean, when he was first confronted, when he first lost this job at the beginning of the book, he could have just spiraled out of control and felt miserable for the rest of his life or for years, but he didn't. And that is a point, there are situations in everybody's life, that not everything is hunky dory. Not everything when you wake up in the morning has changed. But you can wake up in the morning and say, I'm not going to let it change me to be bad. I'm gonna rise above this and make the most of it,
Mhm.
which is exactly what JJ did.
Yeah. So, which character between JJ and Father Thomas, which one do you think you personally connect to or connect with the most and why?
Well, certainly I connect the most with JJ because I was able to pattern his despair after my own. At the beginning where I described what he went into, sort of the funk he went into. I didn't go into it necessarily to that degree, but certainly the mental anguish and despair was like him. I mean, when I got word that I was being transferred from
Hmm.
this job, I called a coworker who was on the same shift as me, and I cried on the phone. I was so sad. So I could put myself into the situation of a fictional character who lost something he thought he would never lose. And there are a couple of places in there where JJ goes to that I have been that I can, I was able to put myself in his place, describe an event that I have not done, but I was able to connect with it.
Right.
But I got to tell you, I really love the character of Father Thomas
Hmm.
because, as I said, Father Thomas to me just completely reflected the joy of writing. I mean, this was a guy I just created out of thin air. I mean, I won't say who he is or what he was. Obviously, as Father Thomas, he's a priest.
Hmm.
I'm not a priest. I was raised Catholic. I knew priests, but I knew nothing about being a priest. I knew nothing about the things that shaped his life. But I was able to create this guy. And man, I just love Father Thomas, right from like Thomas, and I patterned him after Thomas in the Bible, doubting Thomas. And there's a part in the book where people say, people have this bad impression of Thomas in the Bible, the Apostle Thomas, because they say he doubted Jesus, and Jesus had resurrected from the cross. But
Hmm.
there's another part in the book where Father Thomas says when Jesus was going to go to Jerusalem, Father Thomas also says, let us also go to Jerusalem and die with him.
Hmm.
And that's just, if I could be, if at some point I could be, part of me is JJ, a minor part. If I could be Father Thomas in another life, man, I'd be him.
Hmm.
I would totally be Father Thomas. He is one cool guy.
Yes. Do you see this as a standalone novel, or is there potential to revisit these themes or characters in a future work?
Nope, there is no sequel to this book. This is a standalone novel. I like books. I like books where everything isn't nicely buttoned down. Readers have a brain. They're able to read. They're able to comprehend. I want readers to finish, and I do too. When I finish a good book, I'll say to myself, "Gosh, what's going to happen next?" And I maybe play a mind game. What's going to happen next?
Hmm.
For myself, when I finished with these characters, not just Father Thomas and JJ, but there are many other characters throughout this book that they meet along the way. There's a lot of characters in this
Yeah.
book. I leave it up to the imagination of the readers to what's going to happen next. I have never once or twice thought to myself, what would be next for these two guys?
Hmm.
Never. I want them just to be done. Now, I have written another book.
Okay.
It's out to a publisher. It's out to a publisher. The theme is, I suppose the theme is a way, in a sense, that it looks at characters who who need and want a new start, who want to go off in another direction or sort of come to terms with the direction they're in. But the trigger for their story is totally different.
Mm-hmm.
There's no JJ who gets laid off. There's no Father Thomas who wants to go back for his reason. There are characters who, it is a road trip. I love road trips, and I love road trips as a theme, and not as a theme, but as a thread to get through the book, to get to places, and you go to cities. JJ and Father Thomas, they're going to cities that they have not been to, and they are meeting people that they have never met. And in doing so, it's changing them. And that's what my next book is about too.
Okay.
And I'm pleased with it. I have to say I'm pleased with the way it turned out. I'm pleased. People have told me, that they like the book. When I hear that, I'm a small publisher. I'm a small writer. The book it's in several bookstores in the Reno and Carson City areas and in my hometown, but it's not at Barnes and Noble. It sells some on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And, as I tell people, I celebrate every sale. I'm happy with every reader. And it's funny because it's at the senior center in town, and one person bought it, and it's now been passed around to the 8th reader.
Oh, wow.
And I don't look at that as 7 lost sales.
Right.
I look at that as 7 more readers.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm happy with it.
Piquing interest.
Yeah, I want people to read. I don't want to say I want them to. I like it when people read it and when they're happy with it. And then that's all I can ask.
Right. Right. Well, why don't you tell everyone where they can follow you on social media? We know your book is available on Amazon, so I'll put that in the description box as well. But where can they find you on social media?
I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and that's it.
And what is your handle?
Oh, let me look. Let me look this up here for a sec. It's facebook.com/bob.drews.3.
Okay.
And let me check Instagram. I was going to go on to TikTok once and try that. You got to put all this stuff in. I'm happy with Facebook and Instagram. It gets the word out. That's good enough for me. I'm by no means, a product of the tech generation. I'm happy when I turn on the computer and it works.
Right.
So on Instagram, I'm at instagram.com/RobertH.Drews/. And if they call that up, they'll see pictures of me. There's a picture on Instagram of me in a bookstore in Reno that was really nice, but sadly went out of business. But there's other bookstores. There's several of them here. If they happen to be in Northern Nevada, if they happen to look at an Amazon or a Barnes and Noble, I'm happy with it. I'm happy to have written it.
Right. And as well, you should be. You should be. So all of your information for social media and where they can pick up the copy of the book will be available in the description. And this was so much fun. I was so glad to have you today. So thank you.
Demetria. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for coming on here and talking more with me about the book.
No, thank you. And thanks a lot for having me on. And I will say, I called up Amazon recently and read the reviews. Did you post a good review of the book, a nice review on Amazon?
I did. I posted it on Amazon.
Boy, I read that. I said, "Wow, holy smokers!" Thank you a lot. I mean, it's such a, very heartwarming. I'm so happy you like the book. In fact, if it's okay, I would like to just copy and paste it and send it to the publisher to say, "Hey, look at this."
Oh, absolutely. You can use it for publicity, for marketing. promotions, however you wish. I do not mind at all. I posted it on Amazon
Oh,
and Goodreads, and then I posted it on my own blog as well.
thank you.